So what I want to give to you today is just some tips and help and advocating for trying to reach out in your communities to find these victims of what I call romance imposter crimes. And I use crime rather than scam, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I like to use the word imposter because these romance criminals are imposters. And I think that helps how we label and define things really have significance. And one of the ways of helping victims understand that this is a crime and these are scams is by using that word imposter, because these people aren't real, except to that victim. Next. Hello? Okay, thank you. So we're going to show this video real quick. This is actually one of my victims. She actually was responsible with myself and some others in starting what I think was the first, at that time, call-in kind of phone support group for romance scam victims. And there's now 2 that I've been in charge of, and we're going to talk about that today, but let's listen to this.
I'm not dead, but I almost died last year. I was a victim of a romance scam by a man I met on eHarmony and lost over $1 million. My husband was, he became sick. He actually got brain cancer. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I fell for it. I met this person. I was in Hawaii on vacation and received this message from a gentleman that stated that he was from Beverly Hills, and we had a few messages going back and forth, and then he wanted my email address and my phone number, and within like 2 days, you know, we were talking on the telephone.
Anyone.
Did we lose it?
Oh.
Could be a victim. Not only do these people get taken and separated from their money, oftentimes their entire life savings, they're also emotionally abused by these scammers.
I believe that he used my social media to cater his wooing to what he thought that I would like. Once he, you know, found out what my name was, I think he immediately went and looked at all my photos, looked at, you know, all the places that I had been, all my posting, and just catered the emails and the communications to my personality. And every time we were supposed to meet, something came up. Oh, I have a cold. Oh, I have this. Oh, I've got to go out of town. So I met him like April 24th. By the beginning of May, or even like around Mother's Day, he was professing his love to me. He had to go to Miami to work on a satellite engineering deal. When he got to Miami, he asked me for $7,500 because his bank account was frozen. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I can do that. You know, that's not a big deal. Then I checked him out, and I had a promissory note, and I trusted him.
Often cyber scammers ask for money real quick and early into the relationship. According to the FBI, Americans lost some $82 million on online dating frauds in just the last 6 months of 2014.
It just started escalating, you know, it just went on and on and on. And he had a story for everything, and it was so detailed and so real that, you know, I didn't know I was being scammed. Towards the end, I started to feel that something was just really not right. Sending my last $110,000 to him, I did not have a good feeling about it, but I went ahead and did it. My heart just sunk. I knew, that was when I knew I was scammed. At the real end of it, he started threatening me, saying that he knew where I lived. It was scary because, you know, if someone has the nerve enough to take that much money from you, who knows what, you know, what they would do. I wanted to commit suicide.
We started the scam support group because there really aren't any support groups for people who have been scammed. So being in this group enables members to feel that they aren't alone. I think it brings them a lot of solace.
I have come so far helping others, and seeing others, recover has really helped me heal.
Take the time out to find out who it is that you're dating. Google images, Google some of the copy of letters that they sent to you or emails that they sent to you to find out if they're real and genuine.
Be aware of someone who wants to leave the dating site immediately and switch to personal email or instant messaging.
If you're not sure about what you're hearing in an email, check in with your friends. Ask somebody who you trust.
Be aware of someone who claims to be from the US but is often traveling or working overseas.
Take the time out and think before sending money, or just hold off on sending money.
Reach out. In your community, no matter where you live, you can call someone. You can call the local police department. They may have resources for you. They may have a support group in your community. You can call Aging Services. Call AARP. At
877-908-3360 or at www.aarp.org/Fraud Watch Network.
I want people to know that there's hope after it, and there's life after it, and it doesn't have to rule your life. You can also, have joy. Your life isn't over.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Galen. So I really like to use that just because it is a good introduction to the phone and now Zoom support groups that are going on, but also it's a message of hope to people that are caught up in this as victims, that victims are resilient and there is a way out for almost hopefully all the folks that are out there if they just reach out, make connections. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about here. So we've all heard about terms like cyber fraud and transnational cyber crimes, and in doing that, I kind of found this quote: "A criminal is committing malpractice if he or she is not using the internet." And seeing that, I kind of added my own little touch to it and said, especially to target, trick, take, and traumatize vulnerable victims, because that's exactly what they're doing. We talk about transnational cyber crimes, and they're basically crimes that have actual or potential effect across national borders. So because of that, a lot of my victims and the family members and people I work with don't realize that my former employer, the FBI, we can't go to Nigeria or Ghana or Malaysia or Canada or Jamaica, some of these countries where we know some of these kinds of crimes are happening, and make arrests in those countries. We have to work with local law enforcement who may or may not be responsive to these kinds of crimes. And it can be very expensive to do things like extradition and take a lot of time, and some countries don't even allow that. So anytime people are sending money overseas, they're really taking a kind of an extra risk. And we do know that a lot of these are transnational criminal enterprises that folks are involved in, not realizing that that single image has a lot of people working behind it. These crimes are increasingly international in scope, affect many, many victims, and they're difficult to apprehend. These are actually professional criminals that may have several or even dozens of people that they're trying to, I guess, hang on to and have so-called relationships with to steal money from them. So definition of a scam is basically a trick or a con used to get you to part with something of value. I kind of think of it as the term as theft with a lie. I really like that definition with it. But you have to realize that even more than that, because scams also imply something where maybe the losses aren't that real. Whereas these kind of crimes, sometimes the losses can be life savings. So next slide, please. Romance imposter crimes, again, I said to you that I like to use the word imposter, and I try to use the word crime instead of scam wherever. I think it really makes that crime more respectful and realizing the seriousness of it. It is also a term that I came up with called cyber-enabled intimate partner exploitation. To these victims, they believe that they're in an intimate partnership. Many believe that they're engaged. I've even had victims tell me that they got married online. So I use this cyber-enabled intimate partner exploitation because that also has many of the characteristics of other kinds of domestic violence or sexual assault and even human trafficking. Next slide. So what's an imposter, a romance imposter crime? It's basically what you saw with our victim in the video earlier. It occurs when a criminal adopts a fake online identity using stolen images to get that victim's attention and affection and trust for financial gain. The criminals will use the illusion of a romantic or close relationship to manipulate, groom, and steal from the victim, use their financial information, and may eventually enlist them as a money mule over several weeks, several months, or even years. I've had victims involved with the same perpetrator for as much as 4 years. Victims may be recruited on dating websites, social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram, Scrabble Go, Words with Friends, all those kinds of things can be ways that they find our victims. Next slide, please. Next slide. Galen? I don't think I can control it.
No, we're getting there, excuse me.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to talk about the tactics, and this, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, even though you kind of saw in the video. What happens is first there's a targeting and a recruitment. They're going to find that target, that either that lonely person, especially in this time of COVID, maybe they're recently widowed or divorced. They're usually 50 and older, although there is a trend now for younger people getting involved in these. The perpetrators will use these chat rooms, social media, the kinds of things I said before, to kind of choose or target victims. They are what I call remote scams, in that they oftentimes will say they're American citizens, even though they might have an accent that you're just kind of like, but they claim to work outside the United States, and they have a lot of excuses as to why they can't meet. Their occupations, if they're males, they're usually either in the military or some covert CIA type of thing that they can't talk about. That also makes them inaccessible, or they're working on an oil rig as some kind of an engineer, or we see a lot of Doctors Without Borders, you know, doing humanitarian kind of work. Those seem to be kind of the big three. For men, if it's a female victim, that oftentimes they are, you know, doing missionary work abroad, they have their own business abroad, or going to school, or things like that. We find that the relationships with men sometimes turn sexual, of course, much quicker than with women. With women, they kind of like to be romanced, whereas I think men are much more visual and, you know, like to see the bikini shots and things like that, and kind of helping to get them to feel that they're being intimate with someone. So what these guys do is they'll create kind of an ideal persona, or an avatar is sometimes a word you used, and that's a character and an image that represents an online presence. And so they steal actual pictures from people, and it might be models that are posted, or just pictures that they've taken from people on Instagram or Facebook and found, and kind of pretend to be that person. And the victim doesn't understand that that image is not who's behind it. They'll do a lot of information gathering or a mirroring of experiences. You know, whatever a victim tells them, they've had a similar experience, and they're going to be compassionate and empathetic and all these kinds of things. They're almost like just the dream prince or princess charming, you know, the Hallmark dating kind of thing is right with what they're doing. They'll share their dreams online, particularly early. And I want to just make mention that these victims of image theft exploitation are also victims, the people behind the images, and some of them are really get harassed even by the victims of the romance scams themselves, you know, not believing that the image isn't real and demanding their money back, or, you know, when they find out they've got a wife and kids, it's like, how could you do this to me? And the guy goes, I don't know who you are. They do a lot of seduction and love bombing that makes the victim feel wanted, really intense emotions. They kind of isolate the victim from real life connections, kind of transferring that onto the imposter being everything for them. They're very much into grooming, a lot like, again, the human trafficking. They're in control of the relationship, planning the future together, kind of do a lot of that. They'll lavish victims with gifts, so you believe that you kind of owe them. They won't stop complimenting you. They might bombard you with texts at all hours, wanting a reply. They'll want an immediate commitment on things. They're going to be overly needy or demanding that you even have to disrupt or not not participate in your own family and friends things. So they don't have that kind of respect for boundaries and other commitments that a real, hopefully healthy relationship would have. It's kind of overwhelming intensity that a lot of these people will misperceive as intimacy or even love. The execution of the financial request, they'll start out small, kind of as a test, and if you pass that test and send money, they're going to ask for more and more and more and more, and it'll escalate until actually the victim has no money. They will try to get victims to borrow money from different causes, and this will all be a financial sacrifice needed to kind of prove their love. It's also a way we can be close, we can be together sooner if you get this money for me for my business deal, or whatever it is to move the money out of the country or the gold out of the country, whatever it is that they need. So victims may actually steal or borrow from family and friends and work and get themselves further and further and further in debt. I've had victims even sell their homes and cars. And I've had one victim actually living in kind of the truck, living in his truck because he'd given everything to his scammer. They'll use coercion and threats, sextortion, identity theft, and other kinds of financial and cyber crimes usually will come a little bit afterwards. And once they've been identified as an imposter, they may ghost the victim. That means just totally drop out. The victim doesn't hear from them anymore, even though they're frantic. What happened to you? Where's my money? What happened to our dreams? And they might reappear as a new suitor, or later reveal their true selves. Hi, I'm a 19-year-old young man in Nigeria or Malaysia. And yes, I was scamming you, but in the meantime, I really fell in love with you. So, let's stay together. So those are some of the common tactics that they do. And I'm sorry I spent a long time on that slide, but I really want you to kind of understand the basics of this. So let's go into the next one. This is the way money can be sent to criminals. They'll wire money using Western Union and MoneyGram. We don't see that as often anymore. I think like we used to, partly because of the lawsuit that with Trade Commission and gaps that made it easier to steal, and doing a lot more in the training programs of that. So the criminals, these imposters, have moved to reloadable debit cards and gift cards. Be aware that a lot of folks aren't, and I've got a copy of it here. It is now illegal for telemarketers to ask for reloadable debit cards or wiring money as part of a phone call pitch. So any kind of payment, if you're getting a call and they ask for that kind of a payment, hang up the phone because you're talking to a scammer, or hopefully don't even pick it up. Sending, receiving, or forwarding cash, wiring money through a bank, opening bank accounts at the request of the imposter, and transferring whatever funds that you get often to another victim, or sometimes to a person that might be part of that cell living in the United States, and then that money goes, passes on and on. Purchasing and forwarding equipment, computers, cell phones. I've even had night goggles victims sent. They might be receiving counterfeit checks in which the victims cash and then forward the money to that imposter, and then they're of course held responsible for that check. And again, victims being used as money mules, and we'll talk about that. We are seeing a new trend of Bitcoin and other alternative currencies, and I kind of posted a picture there of kind of the Bitcoin ATMs. We're seeing that a lot with kind of a blending of a hybrid kind of thing, where oftentimes the scammers might start out as lottery and then they'll fall in love with their victims, and then it moves into an investment kind of thing. So you're kind of seeing the blending of all these, and oftentimes they're asking people to put $20 bills or their credit cards into these Bitcoin machines, and that money is virtually untraceable for most purposes. Next. So why are older adults targeted? We know that there's been an AARP study, and it makes sense. People 50 and older hold 83% of the wealth in the United States. So was it Willie Sutton when asked supposedly why he robbed banks? Because that's where the money is. So that's often why older adults are also targeted. They're often perceived as financially stable and have a nest egg, excellent credit and all this, especially from people overseas. But in reality, some of our victims really are experiencing financial insecurity, and they're still targeted for these crimes. There's often a history of prior victimization or trauma in these folks' lives. It might be domestic violence, prior child abuse, just other kinds of things that happen in their lives that may make them more susceptible to this. There may be cognitive and medical issues as well, but I think the major causes are the next three that I talk about. And certainly most on those, I think, is loneliness, especially during COVID or after the death or divorce of a spouse. I had one daughter of a victim who said, Debbie, there is absolutely nothing that you or your FBI agent or the bank manager or any or doctor, anyone can do. She's waited her whole life to hear the words that she's hearing from this man, and nothing is going to stop her because she's just getting so much from that. Another thing is they don't understand the nature of the technology being used against them. And I think this is really critical and something that we can definitely help in further education. We don't know much about transnational cyber criminal enterprises. And when we hear the word scam, that's certainly usually not what we're thinking about. And the fact that we can't make arrests in foreign countries, that money probably is gone. I think people are on guard against violent crime and not financial or cyber crime, or even how, it'd be great to have TV shows or other kinds of awareness programs on how to be cyber safe. And just knowing if someone's lying online, I think can be important things. And then I think finally the need for hope or purpose, a way to be important to a loved one again. And I had one victim tell me that the reason she got into it, she was just looking for someone to grow old with. So I think those are important kind of things to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about what are we going to replace the behavior with. Next slide. Your world dies before you do. And basically, we'll go through this real quick. The New York Times talked about loneliness being a growing trend, and certainly it's even more so now. But look at the stats they came up with. 1/3 of adults over 65 living alone, 1/2 of those over 85 living alone. And the other survey, we'll go down to the bottom, 57% said that they had no close friends. 24% said they no longer felt important to anyone. So if you were one of these romance imposter scammer or one of these other kind of scammers, who are you going to be targeting? If I was one of those folks, I'd be targeting that 24% who said they no longer felt important to anyone. Because you know what? As a scammer, I can make sure that you know you're important to me. It might not be for the reasons that you want, but I can sure do that. And that's what they do. Next slide. Okay, so a lot of folks haven't heard of this term, and I like to include it just because I think it's a wonderful concept. It's kind of my bucket to put all the kinds of variables that might affect someone being involved in this. Dr. Lux and Dr. Hahn, two of my kind of heroes in this, talked about age-associated financial vulnerability. And when I'm talking to family members and even some victims so that I feel kind of understand this and kind of take that in. It's a pattern of risky behavior related to money that puts an older adult at substantial risk for loss of resources that might result in a dramatic change in their quality of life. And this is the important part, that's inconsistent with the choices that they made when they were younger. So if these are changes that somebody made that they wouldn't have done 10 years or 20 years ago, this is a really good definition. I don't need to know that it's a diagnosis, and we'll do the next slide, please. I don't necessarily need to know that it's impairments in vision or hearing or social isolation, loneliness, depression, kind of those kind of factors, other than, as a means to help get them out of that. But knowing that it's just financial, this kind of age-associated financial vulnerability kind of helps me to understand that, this is different than what they were doing before. And Dr. Locke said, it's my hope by coining this term, it'll begin to get physicians and others to think about this with older people with and without cognitive problems. In the same way we've begun to ask about advanced directives and driving safely as people age. I think it also shows the importance of setting up a financial plan for the future. Who's going to assist? Who's going to become a power of attorney and under what conditions when necessary? These are difficult conversations to have with our parents or our children. But very much needed. It's very important that this be part of that conversation, such as you could say, this is what I want to happen, or no, I have done. If my financial decision-making starts to get rocky, what should my loved ones do? And we need to be talking about those kind of things in advance. Next slide. So, recent federal laws. This morning you heard Bill Marshall talk about the Senior Safe Act, which is a wonderful law that was passed that now allows banks, credit unions, investment advisors, etc., to report suspected financial exploitation of those aged 65 and older to things like Adult Protective Services or law enforcement without the threat of being sued if they're trained. So, more information on that link there. The second thing is the Elder Abuse Prevention and Protection Act, and I am just so in love and thankful for this act because it really has changed, I think, how the federal criminal justice system, Department of Justice, has really turned around and been able to develop more resources, more investigative agencies involvement, and more prosecutions and more collaboration both with locals as well as internationally working on these kinds of crimes. So I have information linked onto those things. There's many, many parts of it, but a really important law to look at, and it really has made changes. The other thing is oftentimes I get asked if there's a federal reporting requirement for elder abuse. And while there is one for child abuse, there is no federal mandated requirement that we report elder or dependent adult abuse. But however, there is a federal guideline under the Attorney General's that requires Department of Justice employees to report it and to provide appropriate services and referrals where needed. But it doesn't have that mandate or being charged with a misdemeanor for failure to report. Next slide. So this morning you heard a little bit about the National Elder Fraud Hotline. I like to mention that because I believe that also came directly out of this law. It was started up in about March of this year. It is the one-stop place that I wish we could get every police department, every adult protective services, every legal aid group, every senior center, every agency to have this as a resource that they list, because it is truly the first place that you should send somebody who's been a victim of one of these kinds of crimes. They're open 7 days a week, and you see the long hours. I like to say that they have scammer hours, because we know our scammers sometimes will call on weekends and evenings, and so this is available many, many languages. They have people that will actually help people fill out their IC3 and Federal Trade Commission complaints, and just really go the distance in providing resources and services for these folks. So I really encourage you. You can actually go on their website, and there's camera ready stuff that you can link to get just wonderful images like this onto your websites for your own agencies. Next slide. So not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the reason I have it is as a result again of that Elder Justice Act, U.S. Department of Justice has been doing sweeps. And the first one was done only like 6 months after the law passed. But let's take a look at this, because these are places where the Department of Justice targeted federal crimes or civil actions where the victims were 60 or older, or where 50% of the victims in a case were 60 or older. So the first one, this is international, all right? So this is victims, we have perpetrators both in the United States as well as all over the world. So over 150 defendants were charged, causing over $500 million in losses to over 1 million victims. Again, these are federal crimes. A lot of these victims I don't think are showing up in APS or other kinds of research. Let's go back to the third sweep then. In 2020, they focused on these money mules. Over 400 defendants. Look how many more than the first sweep, in excess of $1 billion in losses. And that's basically provable losses because, again, these are indictments or charged crimes. Actions were taken to halt the conduct of over 600 domestic money mules. So, you know, those folks are here and they're doing damage. The U.S. tripled the number of criminal prosecutions brought against these money mules. So very important to know that these kinds of things are happening federally, I think, in response to that law. Next slide, please. The other thing about that pass, the way we found those million victims or so, or the 2 or 3 million we talked about, they were found because they had, for the most part, filed a report with the Federal Trade Commission and or the Internet Crime Complaint Center. And I really urge people to report to both. I have the links to the pages. IC3.gov is the Internet Crime Complaint Center that's run by the FBI, and the Federal Trade Commission, you can get on to their complaint by going to ftc.gov. It's critical law enforcement agencies, adult protective services refer victims to these databases. I've had victims and family members tell me they've gone to police departments and been told, oh, we can't handle that. It's a civil matter, especially for romance scams. Or they don't even give them the referrals to IC3 and the Federal Trade Commission. On the other hand, I'm aware of 2 adult protective services. One of those is Ventura County, where APS workers will actually file those reports. And we have police departments here in California where their volunteers will actually help fill out FTC and IC3 complaints for victims. So, you know, it kind of varies. But it's really important to document the financial details and put in that perpetrator information. I always tell my victims to think like a detective. You know, they're not going to go in and say, oh, Victoria, look like she has, you know, a complaint here. She lost $10,000 in a romance crime. maybe I'll investigate that one today. It doesn't work like that. What they're going to do, as it did most detectives or an agent, they're going to go in and find bank accounts that match, or an IP address that matches up to something they're investigating, or money that's wired to somewhere or from somewhere. So you've got to think like a detective and really put that financial information in. Anyone can complete that form. Victims should always download or print a copy so that they can get it, because you can't go back and access it once you've filed it and submitted it. They may need help in filling out that form, which is why I like that National Elder Fraud Center and just family members or other agencies that can help. I had one victim said to me, it's like visiting my crime scene. You're asking me, I just can't do it. This victim had over 20 transactions to enter, wireys from banks, and it was just impossible for her to do, yet really important so she can be hopefully included and contacted about a possible investigation or prosecution. Next slide. So FTC data, and just real quick, I just want you to be aware how predominant these crimes are. Between 2015 and 2019, almost 85,000 romance scam complaints were filed, roughly the size of the population of Santa Fe, New Mexico. The median loss, look at that, for ages 70 or older is 10,000. Again, I worked with many victims who had $2 and $3 million stolen in these kind of crimes. I did look up Vermont data, and for the first 2 quarters of 2020, and this is all crimes, not just romance scams, the Federal Trade Commission had 1,127 complaints for $1.3 million in reported losses. And they said that imposter scams were the highest number of complaints they were getting. So you can also go on, if you go down to the data visualization, FTC has some wonderful charts and things that you can go and look at by state or crime. It's just a lot of fun to kind of look at those charts. Next slide, please. The FBI also has their own data that they've done, and what you find is that in 2019, nearly 20,000 confidence and romance scam victims filed complaints, accounting for $475 million in losses. And you can go back and look at these earlier years and just see how much this is increasing each year. And again, from looking at the statistics for the Internet Crime Complaint Center for Vermont, 500 victims reported for all crime categories, losses of over $2 million. So next slide, please. So money mules, we're gonna talk about that real quick. Victims are often recruited to be money mules, and that's someone who's recruited and groomed by the scam predators, serve as an intermediary to accept and further transfer property to any lawn. May or may the and we usually refer to that as witting, meaning they are aware, or unwitting. And it's often the goal of to try to get victims to do that once they've taken all the money from them. I often use the term money mover instead of money mule because it seems to make it a little more clear to victims that that's what they're doing. They are being prosecuted in both the United States and federally, and be aware this is money laundering. Next slide, please.
Roses, 12 dozen red roses. And then the next thing that he sent to me was an Easter basket. Heartwarming. I thought, okay, this guy's genuine. He's genuinely kind and sweet, very nice looking. My sister says, Sue, why don't you try online dating? I'm like, okay, what happened? And that's how it started. His name was Kenneth. He was in Nigeria building a shopping mall. He would start these words that, oh honey, I love you, I miss you, I trust you. When the package arrived, I was very surprised. They had packets of money orders. He gave me a list online to mail such and such amount of money to his suppliers. And I did that. I said, something's gotta be wrong. Why doesn't he have somebody doing this, like an accountant? I went in there to my bank. I asked them if this check was counterfeit, and they said yes. My heart was in pain. There's not a day or night that goes by where I just want to say, I want to call these people up and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what this person not only did to me, but did to them. Because they were scammed. mean it. And I didn't know. I did not know.
Next slide, please. So that poor person was what we call an unwitting money mule, and a very apologetic one, which is good, but oftentimes they can move from unwitting to witting. So when we're talking about don't be a mule, mules are recruited in several different ways, actually. Sometimes it can be through things like Craigslist or other kinds of social media. I've seen ads kind of recruiting college students. You'll find sometimes, you know, wives of military. We've got gang members. Gangs are increasingly getting involved, and because it's good money as a mule, because oftentimes they can take a cut of what they have. So there's different ways that they can be recruited, and almost anybody can work as a mule. They are a critical component of cyber frauds. What we are doing now, kind of federally, as well as in some police departments, is they're issuing what they call cease and desist warning letters. And when police or, again, an agent identifies someone as an unwitting money mule, they're given that letter and warned that if they're caught doing that again, they can be prosecuted. And from what I understand from some of the U.S. Attorney's Office Elder Justice Coordinators, this has been being used pretty effectively. Next slide, please. So this is an example of an unwitting money mule. So this woman, Tracy Vester, she was involved in an online romance scam with a soldier, so you know, a victim. Once she realized she was scammed by him, she actually volunteered to help the scammer by posing as a money mule, whose job was to relay the funds from the victims to these soldiers overseas. So she not only got herself involved in this, but she also, she forwarded the money as she could through her bank accounts to the person in Nigeria. She actually had her 16-year-old daughter also receive and send money, and then she and her mother, Karen, actually pleaded guilty to participating in the theft. This was a local case out of Colorado, and they were sentenced to a combined 31 years in state prison. So once they started knowing what they were doing, but getting some money from doing that, she went into becoming a witting money mule and was prosecuted. Next slide, please. I'd like to show that one because I just think this poor woman, if she'd gotten the help on the early stages, she wouldn't be spending this time in prison now. So early intervention is really critical. So assisting in chronic older victims, I really think it's important for you to know one-time interventions aren't going to work for the most part. It took these victims that were weeks, months, years to get into this. They're going to need some considerable time to work it out and get done. And I think for a lot of you, if you've decided to lose weight or to exercise, that's oftentimes not a one-time decision. There's a lot of contemplation and maybe false starts and relapses and things that go into it. So next slide, please. Okay, I want to talk about this federal conviction because I think it shows kind of a good example of some of the impact of this that's been documented. This guy Samola, he's really a Nigerian who was living in South Africa. He was sentenced in 2017 to 27 years in federal prison, a huge sentence for a financial crime like this. He was a ringleader of a criminal organization in South Africa, victimizing women all over the United States and probably other countries. He was extradited from South Africa. The exact amount of their losses, just like the exact number of victims, there's probably a lot that never identified or filled out their IC3 or FTC report. But he was ordered to pay $1.7 million. There was over $200,000 in proceeds from the sale of 4 properties in South Africa that he had that was ordered to be returned to the victims. So they are giving some of that restitution back, and he's going to be deported to Nigeria afterwards. But he portrayed himself basically as a soldier or an engineer who met most of the people on Match.com. He would shower them with poetry, cards, flowers, chocolates, stuffed animals. And of course, these were all paid for with stolen credit cards or the victim's own money. But again, these were the gifts that to these victims meant that they really cared. His purpose was to lead each of his victims to believe he was her Prince Charming, her one true love, and the man she was destined to spend the rest of her life with. Several women had bought wedding dresses. One victim applied for credit cards, giving them cash advances of over $97,000. She was one of 3 victims that eventually declared bankruptcy. 2 victims considered suicide. Several lost their jobs, their homes. 2 women were induced to perform sex acts, which he recorded and published online. He told one by the time he was done with her, she would want to kill herself and pledged to ruin her life unless he was paid more money. And these are common kinds of things that sometimes these guys will do. Next slide, please. So the judge called it one of the most devastating crimes one could ever imagine without laying hands or eyes on another. Conspiracy, mail, and wire fraud, again, fractured these families, desires to die, humiliation and shame so extreme. His charm turned to bullying, name-calling and extortion, demands and threats. Thoughts of paradise turned into thoughts of hell, and for some, thoughts of suicide. Dr. Monica Whitty, who is one of the experts and has been studying romance scams for years, testified that the victims had indeed suffered a substantial and severe psychological impact. They've experienced potentially permanent life-altering changes in their lives. Long-term effects remain years and years later. And yet again, our outreach to victims of these kind of crimes, as other kinds of transnational crimes, is very, very limited. And they really need our help. Next slide, please. So impact, I'm not going to go through all these, but these are just some of the impacts I found in dealing with financial cyber crimes in general, but I've seen each of these happen in romance crimes as well. Again, the loss of faith, risk-taking versus withdrawal, trust in other people. Sometimes you take more risk because you need to get that money back, or you're so desperate for that relationship in your life. The anger, depression, fear, guilt, all of these kind of things. Reputation issues, especially if there's sextortion. And again, the loss of just all the money that you had planned to live on. Next slide, please. I was told there might be some domestic violence and sexual assault agency people here, so I kind of included this one at the request of Tori. This is kind of the physical violence and sexual violence power and control wheel that is used a lot in describing kind of the relationships of the abuser to the victim. And it uses the ones that I see here, the intimidation, coercion, economic abuse, all of these kind of things we also see with these romance crimes. They'll often use children. They might pretend to have children. Oftentimes they may have real children that they actually involve in the scams, but they also will use sextortion, identity theft, account takeovers, installing malware in the computers, and again, getting people involved as money mules. So very, very close to the kinds of these things you see in the other kinds of sexual and domestic violence. Next slide. Common beliefs of the victims. Again, Dr. Whitty's research shows that the main psychological trait is often belief in true love, romantic destiny. So the idea that you're financially having to sacrifice for your soulmate doesn't become unreasonable. If this is your fiance and they need this money to make it possible for you to be together, you're more likely to do it. And again, we've talked about the past traumatic events. There's actually some findings that said the imposter might be perceived as having a stronger and more intimate relationship than a physical relationship. And one victim just said to me, this could not be a scam because scams are not as intimate as what I'm experiencing. And I often think when I'm talking with them, you know, they'll say, this guy is just so perfect. His words, these are the things I wanted to hear. And I kind of say, yeah, but if you were sitting across from him in a coffee shop and you kind of saw that, you know, he chews with his mouth open, or, you know, you go to his or her car and it's junked out, or maybe they're super neat and that really bugs you. There's a lot of nonverbal cues you're not getting. You're just relying on words and an image. So sometimes that can be more real than actually a physical relationship. The secrecy and withdrawal, the shame, guilt, and embarrassment, kind of fearing the consequences, what happens if they do try to tell, that family and friends will desert them or try to conserve them or control their assets. All these kind of things have happened. I've had people that are actually married and still involved in these unrelenting relationships. They certainly don't want their partner knowing. Victims may lie or refuse to provide information on their victimization or the romance imposters. And again, they're going to be vulnerable to re-victimization out of that emotional need or the need to get their money back. So a lot of people have talked about codependency or taking of the brain or being hypnotized or under the ether. All of those are kind of terms describing sometimes where victims are while this is going on. Next slide, please. So what we got to do, I'll spend the next few slides talking about how do we kind of interrupt that cycle. We've got to, assessment is a continual process, and you really want to begin where the victim is and build that rapport and trust first if you can with them. And as an advocate, that's going to be a lot easier to do than a law enforcement that maybe has to go in and get that information. But to the extent you can, build that rapport first. Victims are going to be very vulnerable at this early intervention stage, and they're not going to always identify as a victim. They may hope that it's all going to turn out, or that they hope to show others it's real, and so they, persist in it. There can be shame and guilt that prevent them from reporting or seeking help or telling their support systems. They may start thinking about it, that it might be a scam, but not be willing to share with you yet. But I've often found that victims may shut down and refuse to cooperate if they're approached too strongly or judgmentally. They're often being told by the fraudsters, groomed and coached not to tell. So you're going to be also assessing for suicidality. Are there threats being made to these victims? Are they working as a money mule? Is sextortion involved? What is the extent of the losses? Is this life-threatening? Are they going to have to move or declare bankruptcy? How is that money being spent? Because that's all valuable data that you can use when you're trying to intervene. And then I just defined kind of what sextortion is, that the impersonator urges and manipulates the victim into sending explicit images, getting naked on camera, performing sex acts. The resulting images and video are then used to threaten for more money or silence or not cooperating, kind of depending. And again, there's cultural, religious, medical, cognitive, trauma-informed considerations that we really want to take into consideration. And I think even kind of one of the really significant things is just not only does the victim have a natural support system, but are they willing to use it? Because you want to identify and support those folks as well. I've had many a phone call at 8 o'clock on a Friday night with just family members in tears with me because they've just given up. They don't know how to stop the perpetrator from getting that money from their parents or a relative. Next slide, please. Okay, and then focusing on the victim's strength. You really want to do that, build that relationship, initiate contacts, make that first call. A lot of victims is very difficult to call, so you want to be checking in with them. Sometimes I'm only able to work for a promise not to send further money, and if I can do that, I'm going to do it. I do request, however, that they try not to tell their so-called boyfriend or girlfriend that they're talking to me or law enforcement, because oftentimes the scammers then impersonate me. So if you guys ever hear that Debbie's doing that, I promise it's not the real me. But I get a lot of Facebook requests from scammers and phone calls and things like that, and I just know it's one of my victims that's given me up again. So focus on their strengths and interests, catch them doing something right, encourage it, no matter how insignificant. I've got a victim I'm working with now, and she's sharing information about other scams, and I'm kind of starting with that and not even approaching the romance, because that's kind of where she's at. Relapse is going to be normal. It's part of that stages of change model that, you know, a lot of folks that are social workers are aware of. If you're lecturing them in the beginning, how likely are they going to want to be to take your calls? And I've actually had victims where they'll start out crying with me in the beginning, and then I kind of do this whole music thing where, especially of a certain age, we'll sing a song at the end of the conversation together. And I know my FBI agents used to walk by my office and they're like, oh, there she goes again. But we'll sing songs like Hit the Road, Jack, or I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair, or I Am Woman, or, you know, just different songs like that to try to get them and build their skills. And they'll come and tell me that they sang that song on a Saturday, take his call. Or I had one victim tell me 6 months later, she said, needed to hear your voice and hear that silly song again. So again, that rapport and having your relationship be meaningful. Next slide, please. So intervention is a process. It's not a one-time visit. Help them research. There's great online resources. YouTube has some wonderful victim experiences that are available. Google reverse image search or TinEye. But a lot of times your victims won't know how to cut and paste and put it into those kinds of things. So you may need to show them how to do it. Or there's websites that help explain that. There's a lot of different Facebook groups now and Instagram groups that actually have been wonderful in helping romance scam victims. There's a couple that I'm not too impressed with, but many that are. And victims can be there for support to each other and help them figure this stuff out. And they're 24/7, so I really encourage my victims to kind of look into some of those. Explain the role of the State Department, and I'm going to go into that in just a minute. But basically, the State Department has a phone number where victims can call in. And if someone's asking for money because, you know, the money was stolen from them, or they have a hospital bills or whatever is going on, victims can actually wire money through the U.S. Embassy in that country. And that perpetrator, or that, if it's a real boyfriend, girlfriend, can actually pick that money up at that embassy, but they have to show ID, which none of these scammers can do. So they'll always have excuses to why they can't do it that way. Promises made, I actually sometimes will do a chart where I'll make like a big cross mark, and I'll have the perpetrator's name on one side, you know, maybe it's Andy. So Andy, I have promises made and then promises kept. And then I'll put the victim's name, Victoria. Victoria's promises made and promises kept. And tell them that they can fill that out on their own. But sometimes that helps them to realize basically that they're not getting what they thought out of this relationship other than empty words and empty promises. We talked about the National Elder Fraud Hotline and how important that is. I also work a lot with family members. You know, it's really, really critical because they're so alone too. I help to manage expectations and holding the predator accountable, that just because you file a report with IC3 and the FTC doesn't mean that you're going to get a call from someone. It's a depository or a library for complaints. And the same thing with getting your money back. You know, even if you confront your scammer, these are criminals. You're not going to get, that money's gone. You're not going to get your money back in that way. And again, being available. Next slide, please. We're closing up here. The financial assistance, if there's no family around, who's going to help? I have many situations where victims really are alone out there, and we need to have long-term solutions for those. And as you know, APS is usually a short-term intervention program. So I listed some of the other kinds of things that hopefully could be of help. And again, I think some of the things we'll talk about in a minute with the support groups can also be creditor and legal intervention for money that's borrowed. Sometimes these victims will be judgment proof. Having a letter from a legal aid or an attorney saying that might be critical. A lot of victims have IRS issues. They're being urged to take out money from their IRAs, and then they're having to deal with the tax issues from that. Bankruptcy options and knowing that there's a referral list to nonprofit credit counselors. Preservation of the remaining assets. What if there's a surviving spouse or somebody who is married? And again, encouraging them to close their accounts, banking, credit cards, investments. Law enforcement and family can actually put a block on wiring money if they're still using Western Union or MoneyGram, and I have resources for that at the end. Talking about safety plans. What are they going to do if the perpetrator contacts them again, or a victim wants to resume contact? What do you do? And we've got some suggestions on that. Computer safety practices and identity theft precautions, getting their credit reports. Next slide. So basic cyber fraud, hygiene planning, help in tech equipment. I found so many victims when I go out to visit and I say it's important to block the call, and they're ready to do that, but they don't know how to block a call. No one's taught them that. A lot of my victims pick up every phone message every phone call they get because they don't know how to access voicemail or set it up, or identify something as a spam email, how to cut and paste, again, all those kinds of things that are needed. What is multi-factor authentication and how do you get victims to do that? And again, keeping their systems updated, all these kinds of things, including keeping your dating local and don't go off the dating platforms are important. And I love these 3 programs kind of below: Stop, Think, and Connect, Cyber Seniors, and Fraud Support. All have some great resources for kind of dealing with safety online. Next slide, please. Addressing trauma responses, counseling critical. There's very few financial counseling resources available. We need more for that, but the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, and then there's some resources available through the Department of Justice I have on kind of a resource slide. Be aware of these online social media support groups and grief work, codependency work, grief support, all these kinds of things. I encourage that people tell their doctors, their banks, their investments, their family members, because again, these impersonators can also kind of do serious damage to some of these accounts. And then I want to talk about the phone or video support groups. Next slide, please. We need to identify long-term advocates and support, and these are some of the things that victims need. So there needs to be like a coaching kind of role or a case management, or through the support groups doing these kind of things, helping to understand it's not their fault, that image is not real, what the dynamics of these crimes are, and help with the suggestions of the kind of things we've talked about and ways to reconnect. And I love the program cyberseniors.org. It's out of Canada, but it actually helps people how to learn to cross that digital divide. And learn all kinds of things, how to order groceries online or medicine, or what is Zoom, or how to do Google, and all these kinds of things. And again, the assistance to the family members. Next slide. So one of the things I helped do was start 2 phone support groups that have kind of been moved on to Zoom kind of things now. And we're in the process of getting the 3rd one going. But one is in Los Angeles, California, and that's the Wise and Healthy Aging. And then the second one is the Coalition for Family Harmony. And the first one is actually run by an elder abuse kind of nonprofit, and the second is actually run by a domestic violence sexual assault program. So I kind of have the 2 models that we got started, but it has saved lives. We know we've stopped people from being money mules. we know that we have saved lives, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. The coalition also offers 10 free counseling sessions. Both of these were able to do this through, I think, OVC type of grants. We are setting up our third through, I'm doing one through the Cybercrime Support Network. We're actually putting in a program in North Carolina right now as we speak. Next slide. If you're interested, I would love to help you develop one of those. So anyone interested in starting one of those romance scam groups anywhere in the country, please let me know. But consider these agencies when you're reporting these crimes, and I will be finishing up real soon. That's the Federal Trade Commission and Internet Crime Complaint Center. So critical to report these. Next slide. U.S. State Department I talked about. They do provide warnings and assistance tips, and I often download their page and give that to my victims so that, again, if they're interested in wiring money, this shows them a way that they can do it safely. Oftentimes victims don't know that anyone that's a citizen of the U.S. that's kind of stuck overseas, oftentimes they're told they need money for a lost passport or whatever, that they can get assistance, including a loan to get a ticket home through their closest embassy. So absolutely no reason to be sending money for that reason. And that's usually new information that victims don't know. Next slide. Connections. If you're scammed, what are you going to replace the old behavior with? No matter how old we are, we need a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. So victims' motivation, they just want to be important in someone special's life. So you have to help them find connections and other ways to do that and recognize they are going to be at risk of re-victimization and these kinds of things. And my last message, again, is just don't give up on them. It took weeks and months to get into it, and it's going to take time for them to eventually leave. And I think last slide, and then we'll go through our resources real quick here. I love this slide. This is one way you can have hope.
Is there anything you would want to learn from the internet?
Could you explain a bit about this Facebook something,
okay.
and having to be a friend?
I typed in www.email.com.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Have you ever heard of YouTube?
Yes, I've heard of it, but I have no clue as to what it means.
How many people here have used a computer? Well, we have some teenage volunteers who are willing to teach you how to use the internet.
I think I'm too old.
Hope you have lots of patience, Henry.
Today we're going to go on Facebook. Do you remember how to get there?
Well, I think I just, no.
All these things that I never even dreamed about.
I love it.
Welcome to a whole new world of information.
Every time we're together, Shura just wants to watch cooking tutorials on YouTube. There's a big game called Minecraft. Maybe we could cook something that looks like one of the characters in Minecraft.
Hi, everybody on YouTube.
We should have you doing a music video.
My teeth are as fresh as hot popped corns, my OG teeth.
All of the other seniors are so inspired, so we're going to have a contest to see who gets the most views of their YouTube video.
Hello, YouTube.
Hello, YouTube. Hello, YouTube.
Today we are talking about travel.
Music. Sisterhood. Million Evelyn's is beating mine. I need more hits on YouTube.
This is the big moment that you've all been waiting for. The first prize, winners of the Cyber Seniors competition, goes to...
We all know how difficult it is to learn something new, but we really do feel that it can change your life.
So you got a friend request from...
Hello, Yeo. Who's he?
He's in the same program.
Hold on a second. You got a message. Sure, Edie.
Hello, Ellard.
Oh, dear.
Look at here. Ellard is typing.
Oh, hello, Ellard. Hello, Shura.
Megan said, thank the people who taught you.
You're welcome.
Love you.
They see a program like this and they think it's an opportunity to get in touch with their grandkids and to communicate.
No matter how old we are, we do need a purpose for getting up in the morning.
Okay, next slide. So what I love about this is that it does engage both. There's actually an 800 number where victims can call in to learn how to access the computer and different things on the computer. And it's all done by these young mentors, which is just wonderful. And they have weekly classes every day of the week on all kinds of subjects. So I really urge you to look into it. But finally, ask one more question. When you're working with people that are victims of this, do you have enough money to pay your rent or mortgage or to buy food or pay utilities? Because oftentimes you'll find that they've been tapped out totally. We're going to go through the next slides real quick, Galen. So I want to just go through some resources real quick for you. And in answer to the question about is ICC3 resource only for internet crimes, it is specifically for internet crimes, but they do get other kinds of crimes as well. So if we can, I always try to have my victims file both FTC and IC3 complaints. Sometimes investigative agencies may only check one rather than both. So it's probably always better to do both. They're not going to reject a complaint. And actually, everything is internet connected these days anyways. So I would urge you to do both. So here's some resources to explore on your own. This is kind of what I call my professional toolkit. So when you guys get 15 minutes on your own sometime, just go through each one of these and take a look at it, resources to review. And I specifically just want to mention the Better Business Bureau studies. They have great ones on all kinds of scams done by Steve Baker, 12 to 14 pages long. The ones on romance scams and money mules, really, really good. If you're police, APS, for family members, I'll download a copy, mail a copy. The other one is the U.S. Army, CID. They have a wonderful kind of warning about why you know that this isn't a real soldier that's contacting you. So I urge you to do that. The U.S. Bankruptcy Court, again, how to find those nonprofit counselors, and we'll just kind of leave that slide at that, but some really good resources there to take a look at. Don't be a money mule. Similarly, get 5 minutes, just take a look at some of these things so you'll know they're there and be prepared when you have a victim working on these kind of things. Next. Connecting with others safely. I've got the Cyber Seniors and some other programs that I found and kind of uses referrals, the Virtual Memory Cafe for those with dementia, other kinds of ways, especially during this time of COVID, ways to get people engaged in other ways, more safely. Next. Ways to spot a romance predator. This came out from AARP, and I use this a lot and when I'm talking with my victims, especially when they're ready to kind of start dating again. Next slide. Additional information, the Baker Fraud Report comes out weekly on Thursdays, and it's a great report that you can sign up and be on that listserv just to learn about all kinds of transnational fraud crimes. And again, how to access his scam studies, and then just a report that Dr. Landy and I wrote together on transnational scam victims. Next slide. And this is our MoneyGram, and next slide. The Western Union that tells you how you can block a sender from sending money if fraud is involved. And again, law enforcement, APS, family members can all do this kind of thing. And it actually will put a block, and they'll do investigations if they decide that it's warranted. So I thank you guys very much. I will stay for questions. I know you have a break now, but if you want to stay, I'd be glad to answer, but please take your break too. And you have I think my email is on there, so you can also contact me by email.
Great. And Galen, I think, has a couple questions.
Okay.
So if people want to stay before our 2:15, please feel free to do so. But in the chat, let's make sure we have time for 2 questions. So Galen, go ahead.
Yeah, so we got a question. This was something we talked about in the morning session as well, but Ted Hobson with the Consumer Assistance Program asked, what resources are available to law enforcement to take down scam sites or ads?
I saw that site, and actually I'm going to be taking that. I actually am involved in 2 multi teams help here in one in Santa Barbara. We have a lot of law enforcement, including federal agencies and all, and I'm going to be taking that question. As a victim advocate, that's not something that I know, but I will be doing what I can to try to see if we can get something like that out. And I'll contact the National Center for Elder Abuse as well, because they do a lot with law enforcement training, and that might be a good project for them.
Another question, Galen, our second and last question for Debbie.
I think Debbie actually already answered our other question about the IC3 being a resource for internet crimes versus other types of crimes.
And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. I think I see from Elliot, we don't know the sheer numbers on this because most people probably aren't reporting. And if we can get those reports and get them help, and that's why I'm so thankful for that National Elder Fraud Hotline, but we need to have more things because it's taken these victims so long to get into it, and we can't stay in their lives forever, often as professionals. So the role of this support group, not only for romance scam victims, but my hope is someday that they'll be out there for lottery and other kinds of chronic victims as well. And then a third kind of support group for our family members dealing with these kinds of things. And hopefully these kind of things can be started all over the country.
Well, Debbie, thank you so very much for joining us today. This session has been recorded if you'd like to share it, and Debbie's PowerPoint will be shared in the Google Drive link that will be shared in the chat function. So we have just a few minutes before 2:15. So again, Debbie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.